Let me speak to the part of you that feels tired, not physically tired, but soul tired. The kind of tiredness that comes from pretending you are okay when you are not. The kind that comes from smiling in public and collapsing in private. If you feel lonely, depressed, or lost, I want you to understand something very clearly. There is nothing wrong with you. What you call loneliness may actually be disconnection from your authentic self. What you call depression may be suppressed emotion. What you call being lost may be the result of living according to expectations that were never truly yours. Most people spend 25 years trying to fix themselves without realizing they were never broken. Loneliness does begin in adulthood. It often begins in childhood, the moment you learned that being fully yourself risked losing connection. Maybe you were told you were too sensitive. Maybe your sadness made others uncomfortable. Maybe love was available, but only when you were pleasing, performing, achieving, or staying quiet. So you adapted. You learned to become who you needed to be to survive. You became strong, responsible, independent, successful, easygoing, the caretaker, the achiever, the peacemaker, and slowly, without noticing, you abandoned yourself. Depression is not always a chemical imbalance. Often, it is a signal. It is the psyche saying, I can't keep carrying this false self anymore. It is your body protesting years of emotional suppression. When you numb pain, you also numb joy. When you disconnect from anger, you disconnect from boundaries. When you disconnect from grief, you disconnect from love. And so life begins to feel flat, gray, meaningless. But here, as the truth that can save you decades, your symptoms are not the problem. They are messengers. Instead of asking, what is wrong with me, try asking what happened to me. Instead of asking, why am I so weak, ask, when did I learn I was too loud to feel? The feeling of being lost often comes from living someone else's script. Maybe you chose a career to make your family proud. Maybe you stayed in relationships to avoid abandonment. Maybe you worked hard to prove your worth. But worth is not something you earn. It is something you are born with. The healing path is not about reinventing yourself. It is about returning to yourself. Start with awareness, not judgment. Notice when you say yes but mean no. Notice when you laugh but feel hurt. Notice when you overextend to avoid disappointing someone. Loneliness begins to dissolve the moment you stop abandoning your inner experience. Depression softens when you allow grief to move instead of holding it hostage. Confusion clears when you ask, what do I feel? Instead of, what should I do? Your nervous system learned survival strategies early. It learned hyper-independence. It learned people-pleasing. It learned emotional shutdown. These strategies once protected you. But what protected you at 5 may imprison you at 35. Healing is not about blaming your parents or your past. It is about understanding how your adaptations formed and gently updating them. You don't need to become stronger. You need to become more honest. You don't need to try harder. You need to feel deeper. You don't need more advice. You need more self-compassion. The moment you sit quietly and ask yourself, what am I actually feeling right now? You interrupt decades of unconscious living. And at first, you may feel grief, anger, fear, emptiness. Stay. Because underneath all of that is vitality, curiosity, desire, aliveness. The self you abandoned is not gone. It has been waiting. If you give yourself permission to feel without fixing, to express without performing, to rest without earning, you will begin to notice something extraordinary. You want to feel as lonely because you are no longer leaving yourself. You want to feel as depressed because emotion is finally allowed to move. You want to feel as lost because you are no longer walking away from your truth. This is not a quick fix. It is a reconnection. And reconnection changes everything. You can spend the next 5 years trying to perfect the mask, or you can spend the next 15 minutes listening inward. The choice is quieter than you think, but it is powerful. Come back to yourself. That is where the loneliness ends. Loneliness is often misunderstood as the absence of people. We assume it means not having enough friends, not being in a relationship, or not being surrounded by community. But some of the loneliest individuals are those constantly in the presence of others. They attend gatherings, answer messages, show up at work, smile in photos, and yet inside they feel profoundly alone. This is because loneliness at its deepest level is not about who's around you. It is about whether you are connected to yourself. Self-disconnection begins subtly. It starts the moment your authentic feelings seem inconvenient to the environment around you. Perhaps as a child, your sadness was met with dismissal. Maybe your anger was punished. Maybe your excitement was too much. When expressing your true emotional state threatened connection, your nervous system made a decision. Attachment is more important than authenticity, and so you adapted. You silenced certain feelings. You amplified others. You became agreeable, strong, funny, responsible, whatever secured belonging. Over time, this adaptation becomes identity. You no longer notice that you were performing. You simply believe this is who you are. But beneath the performance lies the unexpressed self, the one with unmet needs, unspoken truths, and unprocessed emotions. When you ignore that inner voice long enough, an internal split forms. The outer self interacts with the world. The inner self remains unseen even by you. That split is loneliness. You can be deeply loved by others and still feel lonely if they are loving a version of you that is real. If you are constantly adjusting your opinions to avoid conflict, constantly minimizing your needs to avoid being a burden, constantly presenting strength when you actually feel fragile, you are participating in your own invisibility. And invisibility breeds isolation, not because others don't care, but because they cannot connect with a self that is hidden. Self-disconnection also numbs vitality. When you suppress painful emotions, you don't just eliminate discomfort. You dull joy as well. Emotional shutdown creates a flatness that feels like emptiness. Conversations feel superficial. Achievements feel hollow. Relationships feel distant. It is not that meaning has disappeared. It is that the part of you capable of experiencing meaning has been muted. Many people attempt to solve loneliness externally. They seek more validation, more social interaction, more success. But external additions cannot repair an internal fracture. You can add people to your life, but if you are not present within yourself, you will still feel absent in their company. The solution is not more connection outward. It is connection inward. Reconnection begins with honesty, not dramatic confessions or radical life changes, but quiet acknowledgments, admitting when you are hurt instead of saying you are fine, noticing when you feel resentment instead of immediately justifying someone else's behavior, allowing tears without labeling them weakness, asking yourself what you need before asking what others expect. As you begin to witness your own inner experience without judgment, something shifts. The internal exile softens. The abandoned parts feel seen. And when you are present with yourself, you bring that presence into relationships. You speak more truthfully. You set clearer boundaries. You listen more deeply, because you are no longer expending energy managing a false self. Loneliness loses its grip when you stop leaving yourself behind in order to keep others close. When your inner world is acknowledged, even solitude can feel connected, because you are no longer split in two. You are home. Depression is often treated as an enemy to be eliminated, a malfunction to be corrected, or a weakness to be overcome. It is labeled, medicated, distracted from, or silenced as quickly as possible. While relief from suffering is important, what often gets overlooked is that depression may carry meaning. It may not simply be a disorder descending without reason, but a message emerging from parts of you that have been unheard for a long time. When emotions are repeatedly suppressed, they do not disappear. The body keeps a quiet record. The child who learned that anger led to punishment may grow into an adult who cannot access anger at all. The teenager who discovered that sadness made others uncomfortable may become someone who smiles through heartbreak. Each time a feeling is pushed away to preserve connection or safety, a piece of vitality is pushed with it. Over years, that emotional constriction accumulates. Depression can be the weight of everything that was never allowed to move. There is often a history beneath the heaviness, a history of adapting, coping, performing, and enduring. Many people who experience depression are not weak. They are exhausted. Exhausted from maintaining an image, exhausted from meeting expectations, exhausted from ignoring their own needs. The mind and body can only sustain that split for so long. Eventually, something slows down. Motivation fades. Energy drains. Interest in once meaningful activities diminishes. It can feel like a collapse, but sometimes collapse is the nervous system. It's a way of saying, I cannot keep living like this. Depression can also signal grief that has never been acknowledged. Grief is not limited to death. It includes the loss of safety, the loss of innocence, the loss of dreams, the loss of the authentic self. If those losses were never mourned, they remain suspended within. When grief has no space for expression, it turns inward. It becomes heaviness, numbness, or emptiness. The flatness many describe is not the absence of feeling, but the protection against feeling too much all at once. Another message within depression can be anger turned against the self. If expressing anger outward felt dangerous in the past, the emotion does not vanish, it redirects. Instead of saying, this situation is unfair, the mind may say, there's something wrong with me. Self-criticism becomes chronic. Shame becomes familiar. The energy that might have fueled change becomes self-blame. Depression then appears as low self-worth, hopelessness, and relentless inner judgment. When viewed through this lens, depression is not random. It is informative. It asks questions rather than providing answers. Where have you been silencing yourself? What boundaries have you been afraid to set? What truths have you avoided acknowledging? What pain have you rushed to intellectualize instead of feel? The symptoms invite curiosity instead of condemnation. This does not mean romanticizing suffering or rejecting support. Professional help, community, and sometimes medication can be essential. But alongside treatment, there can be exploration. Instead of immediately trying to push depression away, you might gently ask what it is pointing toward. Often it points toward unmet needs, unresolved grief, chronic stress, or a life that feels misaligned with your values. As you begin to listen rather than fight, small shifts can occur, allowing tears instead of suppressing them, admitting resentment instead of masking it with politeness, resting without guilt, speaking a boundary, feeling anger without labeling it as wrong. Each honest acknowledgement releases a little pressure. The messenger no longer needs to shout as loudly when it is finally being heard. No child enters the world planning to become anxious, avoidant, perfectionistic, or emotionally distant. Every pattern that later creates struggle once served a purpose. In childhood, adaptation is not a flaw, it is brilliance. A child studies the emotional climate of the home the way a scientist studies data. They quickly learn what brings connection and what threatens it. If laughter softens tension, they become funny. If achievement earns praise, they become high-performing. If silence prevents conflict, they become quiet. These strategies are not conscious choices. They are survival responses shaped by the nervous system as need for safety and attachment. The problem is not that these adaptations form. The problem is that they solidify. What was once flexible becomes fixed. What was once protective becomes restrictive. The child who learned to be hyper-responsible grows into the adult who cannot rest without guilt, the one who soothes everyone else. As emotions becomes the adult who feels responsible for other people, as moods. The child who shut down feelings to avoid punishment becomes the adult who struggles to identify what they feel at all. Perfectionism often begins as a strategy to secure love. If mistakes were met with criticism or withdrawal, excellence becomes armor. The nervous system equates flawlessness with belonging. Decades later, that same person may feel constant pressure to perform, terrified of failure, unable to celebrate achievements because the bar keeps moving. What once ensured connection now produces chronic stress and self-criticism. People-pleasing follows a similar path. If harmony in the household depended on minimizing personal needs, the child learns to scan others for cues. They become experts at reading micro-expressions, tone shifts, and emotional undercurrents. This hyper-attunement feels like empathy in adulthood, but it often comes at a cost. Decisions are filtered through, will this upset someone, rather than, is this right for me? Boundaries feel dangerous. Saying no triggers anxiety. Resentment builds quietly beneath a polite exterior. Emotional shutdown is another common adaptation. When feelings were overwhelming or invalidated, the safest option was to numb. The body learned to disconnect from sensation to avoid pain. In adulthood, this may appear as difficulty accessing joy, trouble forming deep intimacy, or describing emotions in vague terms. The individual might say they feel fine most of the time, yet life lacks color. The protective wall that once shielded them from chaos now blocks closeness and vitality. Hyperindependence can emerge when reliance on caregivers led to disappointment. The child concludes, often unconsciously, that needing others is unsafe. As an adult, asking for help feels humiliating. Vulnerability feels weak. Relationships remain somewhat distant because true intimacy requires dependence at times. The adaptation preserves autonomy but limits connection. These patterns persist not because someone is unwilling to change, but because the nervous system still perceives the world through old lenses. A raised voice from a partner can trigger the same fear once felt in childhood. A minor mistake at work can activate the same shame once experienced after parental criticism. The body reacts before the rational mind has a chance to assess present reality. Recognizing that adult struggles are rooted in childhood adaptations shifts the narrative from self-blame to understanding. Instead of asking, why am I like this? The question becomes, how did this once protect me? That perspective softens harsh judgment. It reveals intelligence where there was once shame. Change does not require erasing these adaptations. It requires updating them. The nervous system can learn that boundaries do not automatically lead to abandonment, that mistakes do not equal rejection, that vulnerability does not guarantee harm. With awareness and repeated corrective experiences, flexibility returns. The patterns that once felt like identity gradually become choices rather than compulsions. Most people experience their symptoms as evidence that something is wrong with them. Anxiety feels like weakness, depression feels like failure, anger feels like being a bad person. Emotional numbness feels like emptiness or defectiveness. The immediate instinct is to get rid of these experiences as quickly as possible, to silence them, override them, or judge them into submission. But what if symptoms are not flaws in your character or defects in your personality? What if they are signals, intelligent communications from a system that has been trying to protect you all along? The human body and mind are built for survival. Long before you developed language or logic, your nervous system was scanning for safety and threat. If you grew up in an unpredictable, critical, neglectful, or emotionally tense environment, your system adapted accordingly. Anxiety may have sharpened your awareness, helping you anticipate conflict before it exploded. Hypervigilance may have kept you attuned to subtle shifts in mood that signal danger. Emotional shutdown may have prevented overwhelming pain when no comfort was available. Even people-pleasing can be understood as a strategy to maintain connection in environments where connection felt fragile. These responses were not mistakes. They were intelligent adjustments to circumstances. The problem arises when the environment changes but the adaptations remain. The child who needed to be hyper-alert grows into an adult whose anxiety activates in relatively safe situations. The teenager who suppressed anger to avoid punishment becomes an adult who cannot assert boundaries. The coping strategy continues long after its original necessity has passed. When you label a symptom as a flaw, you add shame to suffering. Shame tightens the system further. It says, not only are you anxious, but you shouldn't. TB. Not only are you sad, but you are weak for it. This secondary layer of judgment amplifies distress and prevents curiosity. Signals cannot be understood if they are immediately condemned. Anxiety, for example, often signals perceived threat. Instead of asking, why am I so broken? You might ask, what does my system think is unsafe right now? Sometimes the threat is external, but often it is internal. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of disappointing someone. The signal is pointing toward a belief or memory that needs attention. Listening does not mean obeying every anxious impulse, but it does mean acknowledging its protective intent. Depression can signal exhaustion, unresolved grief, or chronic misalignment with your values. If you have been living according to external expectations while ignoring your own needs, your energy may eventually shut down. That shutdown is not laziness, it is a form of protest. It says, I cannot continue like this. Anger can signal violated boundaries. Numbness can signal overwhelm. Even procrastination can signal fear or perfectionism lurking beneath the surface. When you shift from self-judgment to self-inquiry, something softens. Instead of fighting your inner experience, you become curious about it. Curiosity opens space. It allows you to respond rather than react. You might realize your irritability surfaces when you have overcommitted and neglected rest. You might notice your anxiety spikes when you are about to express an unpopular opinion. Each insight turns the symptom into information. This perspective does not deny that symptoms can be painful or disruptive. They can deeply affect relationships, work, and well-being. Support, therapy, and sometimes medical intervention can be essential. But even within treatment, the stance can remain compassionate rather than adversarial. The goal is not to wage war against your own mind, it is to understand it. When symptoms are viewed as signals, the narrative changes from defectiveness to adaptation. You begin to see that your system has been trying to protect you in the only ways it knew how. And protection, even when outdated, is not a flaw. Many people approach healing as if it requires becoming someone entirely new. They imagine that in order to feel whole, they must reinvent themselves, adopt a different personality, change careers, transform their bodies, relocate, or construct a more impressive identity. The underlying belief is that who they are right now is fundamentally insufficient. But true healing is rarely about building a new self from scratch. More often, it is about returning to the self that existed before fear, conditioning, and adaptation reshaped it. Reinvention is seductive because it promises distance from pain. If you can become more confident, more productive, more spiritual, more attractive, more successful, perhaps the old feelings of inadequacy will disappear. Yet when change is driven by self-rejection, it tends to recreate the same internal struggle in a new form. You may achieve outward transformation while still feeling empty inside because the part of you that needed attention was never met, only bypassed. Reconnection begins with a different premise. Nothing is inherently wrong with your core. The anxiety, people-pleasing, emotional shutdown, or perfectionism that developed over time were layers added for protection. Beneath those layers exists a self that once felt spontaneous, curious, expressive, and emotionally alive. Healing does not require inventing new qualities. It requires gently removing what obscured them. In childhood, authenticity sometimes conflicted with attachment. If expressing anger led to punishment, anger was suppressed. If expressing sadness created distance, sadness was hidden. If being playful or loud caused disapproval, that energy was toned down. These adjustments help preserve connection, but they also create a disconnection from the inner world. Over time, you may have lost touch with what you genuinely feel, want, or value. Reconnection asks you to turn inward with patience rather than ambition. It is less about dramatic change and more about subtle awareness, noticing when you agree to something you do not want, noticing when your body tightens around certain people, noticing when joy appears, even briefly. These moments of awareness rebuild trust with yourself. They signal that your inner experience matters. This process can feel unfamiliar or even unsettling. When you stop performing and start listening, old emotions often surface. Grief for years spent disconnected, anger at boundaries never set, fear of how others might respond if you change. Reconnection is not always comfortable, but it is honest, and honesty creates stability that reinvention cannot provide. As you reconnect, decisions begin to shift organically. You may choose relationships that feel mutual rather than obligatory. You may pursue work that aligns with your values rather than only your image. You may speak more directly, rest more freely, create more playfully. These changes arise not from forcing yourself to become someone better, but from remembering who you are beneath the conditioning. Healing through reconnection also softens self-criticism. When you understand that your coping patterns develop for survival, shame decreases. You stop waging war against your personality and instead relate to yourself with compassion. That compassion creates safety within, and safety allows authenticity to emerge naturally. Reinvention focuses on external identity. Reconnection focuses on internal alignment. One is driven by the fear of not being enough. The other is rooted in the recognition that your essence was never the problem. When you reconnect, you are not constructing a new self. You are coming home to the one that has been waiting patiently beneath the noise. Lasting change rarely comes from force. It does not grow well in the soil of shame, pressure, or self-criticism. Many people attempt to transform their lives by pushing harder, setting stricter rules, or berating themselves for every perceived failure. For a short time, that intensity can create movement, but eventually, the nervous system rebels. Old patterns return, often stronger, because they were never understood, only suppressed. Sustainable change begins in a quieter place. Awareness paired with self-compassion. Awareness is the willingness to see clearly. It is the ability to pause in the middle of a reaction and notice what is happening internally, instead of automatically snapping in anger, shutting down in conflict, or reaching for distraction. Awareness creates a small but powerful gap. In that gap, you might observe a tightening in your chest, a rush of fear, a familiar thought of, I am not good enough. You are no longer completely fused with the reaction. You are witnessing it. This witnessing is transformative because you cannot change what you cannot see. Patterns that remain unconscious tend to repeat themselves indefinitely. You may find yourself in similar relationships, similar arguments, similar disappointments, without understanding why. Awareness gently reveals the thread connecting them. You begin to recognize how certain tones trigger childhood memories, how certain expectations activate perfectionism, how certain silences awaken abandonment fears. The pattern moves from mystery to understanding. Yet awareness alone can become harsh if it is not accompanied by compassion. Simply noticing your patterns without kindness can turn into another layer of self-judgment. You might think, I can believe I'm still doing this, or I should be further along by now. That internal criticism activates the same threat response that created the pattern in the first place. The nervous system does not change under attack, it changes in safety. Self-compassion provides that safety. It is not self-pity or excuse-making. It is the recognition that your reactions developed for reasons. When anxiety rises, instead of saying, what is wrong with me? Compassion asks, what am I protecting right now? When you avoid a difficult conversation, instead of labeling yourself weak, compassion wonders, when did speaking up feel dangerous? This shift softens the inner environment. In a compassionate state, the body relaxes. The brain becomes more flexible. New choices become possible. If you notice you are about to people please, awareness identifies the impulse. Self-compassion reassures the part of you that fears rejection. Together, they create space to experiment with a different response, perhaps setting a gentle boundary or asking for time to think. Even if the attempt feels imperfect, compassion prevents the spiral back into shame. Change built on awareness and compassion, unfolds gradually. It does not demand instant transformation. It celebrates small moments, catching a critical thought before it spirals, naming an emotion honestly, choosing rest instead of overexertion. Each small act reinforces a new internal relationship. You become someone who listens rather than attacks, who understands rather than condemns. Over time, this internal shift ripples outward. Relationships feel more authentic because you are responding from presence instead of old wounds. Decisions feel clearer because they arise from alignment rather than fear. Emotional waves move through more fluidly because they are allowed rather than resisted. Awareness illuminates the pattern. Self-compassion makes it safe to change the pattern. Together they create an internal climate where growth is not forced but naturally unfolds. So if you remember nothing else from these words, remember this: you are not broken. You are patterned, and patterns can be understood. You are not weak. You are adapted, and adaptations can be updated. You are not lost. You are disconnected, and disconnection can be healed. The loneliness you feel is not proof that you are unlovable. The depression you carry is not evidence that you are defective. The anxiety that grips you is not a life sentence. These are signals, invitations to turn inward rather than run outward. You do not need to become someone else to be whole. You do not need to earn rest, justify your feelings, or perfect your personality to deserve peace. What you are searching for has never been outside of you. It has been waiting beneath the noise, beneath the fear, beneath the roles you learn to play. If you give yourself the courage to become aware, truly aware, and the kindness to meet what you find with compassion, change will not feel like force. It will feel like returning to your body, returning to your truth, returning to the self you left behind in order to survive. And when you come back to yourself, something profound happens. The loneliness softens because you are no longer abandoning your own experience. The depression lightens because emotion is finally allowed to move. The confusion clears because your inner voice is no longer drowned out by expectation. This is not about fixing yourself. It is about knowing yourself. It is about choosing moment by moment not to leave when things get uncomfortable inside. 15 minutes of honest awareness can begin a shift that saves you years of unconscious repetition. Not because everything changes overnight, but because you do. Come back to yourself. Stay with yourself. And watch how your life begins to feel like it belongs to you.